Blackwater Ben by William Durbin, Chapter 2. As Ben picked up the breakfast dishes, he thought back to the day Pa had asked him to the logging camp. That particular morning began like any other in Blackwater. Ben walked across town to the one-room schoolhouse, wishing he could skip to class. It was the last week in October, but Ben was already sick of school. No matter how hard he tried to behave, he was always getting in trouble. He never sassed his teacher, Miss Standish, or called her by her nickname, Miss Stench, like some of the boys did. But he was always getting scolded for blurting out answers and not being able to sit still. Ben couldn't help that he was talkative. He'd grown up chattering with Mrs. Wilson, a kindly white-haired widow who helped raise him after his mother died. Ben was just a baby when he and Pa had moved to Ivy Wilson's boarding house in Blackwater, and Mrs. Wilson had been like a grandmother, mother, and aunt rolled into one. Mrs. Wilson was fond of saying, "Conversation is an art of worthy cultivation." But in Miss Standish's room, a student wasn't allowed to say a word unless they were called on to stand beside their desk and recite. When Ben forgot himself and spoke out of turn, Miss Standish aimed her ruler at him like she was sighting down a rifle. "Benjamin J. Ward," she'd say. Her hair was pulled into such a tight bun that her eyebrows were half moons. "I must remind you to show proper decorum like your classmates." Ben wasn't sure what decorum meant, but he knew that only the other students in 7th grade were two prissy, apple-polished girls named Abigail Montgomery and Martha Newcomb. At exactly 8 o'clock every morning, Miss Standish rang her bell, and the 19 first through the 8th grade students lined up outside of the front door of the school. With the girls on the left and the boys on the right, they marched silently in and hung their coats on opposite sides of the room. Once the students took their seats, they had to keep their feet flat on the floor, backs straight, hands folded on top their desks. When Ben tugged at his itchy collar, Miss Standish pointed at her ruler and said, "Stop that fidgeting, Benjamin Ward." After she took attendance, Miss Standish said, "Class, you may stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance." By then, Ben was twisting in his seat and grateful for a chance to stretch. The school day was a steady stream of reading, spelling, arithmetic, and penmanship. As difficult as it was for Ben to sit in silence, it pained him more to watch the younger students forced to be quiet. At recess, Ben did his best to see that everyone had fun. King of the Hill was their favorite game, and Ben made sure that everyone got to play. Even though Abigail and Martha teased him from the girls' side of the playground, Ben didn't get yelled at again until after lunch, when Miss Standish had held her once-a-week blab school session. During blab school, everyone opened their McGuffey readers and read out loud at the same time. It was hard enough for Ben to concentrate when it was quiet. His book was filled with dull poems by authors with yard-long names like William Cullen Bryant or Oliver Wendell Holmes. As soon as the chorus of readings began, he got an instant headache. Ben only moved his lips and pretended to read, but after a while he got bored and tried to improve on the seashell poem he was supposed to be studying. "This is the ship of a pearl, which poets feign, sails of the unshamed main." Instead, he recited his own lines. "If only this ship would go down the drain and spare my aching brain." "Benjamin," Miss Standish suddenly shouted behind him, "how dare you defile the words of the chambered nautilus?" That afternoon, Ben had to stay after school and wash the blackboards, fill the inkwells, and carry in firewood. On his way home, he met Nell, a lady with a bright red hair who owned the fanciest saloon in town. Nell favored purple dresses and tall feathered hats. "You look like you've had a rough day, Mr. Ward," she called, her raspy voice blaring through the open door. "Careful to belly up to the bar?" "No, thank you, ma'am." Ben blushed, even though she knew he was teasing. Most of the joints on Main Street were tents and rough board shacks, but Nell's place had a player piano, a plate glass mirror, and a polished mahogany bar with a brass footrail. Nell's long ruffled skirt swished as she stepped outside. The wooden sidewalk echoed under her high buckled shoes. "Is that old Miss Stinker being mean to you again?" Nell laughed and tousled Ben's hair. Ben looked across the muddy streets to see if anyone had overheard. "She ain't been too bad," he said. Nell smiled. "You're a crafty man, damning by faint praise like that. I'd better get home, ma'am. I promised to help Miss Wilson with her canning." "She's lucky to have you," Nell said. When Ben got to the boarding house, Mrs. Wilson was already packing her first jar of pickles. The kitchen smelled of warm vinegar and dill. "You're late," she said, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "By any chance, did Miss Standish keep you after school?" "How'd you know?" "Abigail stopped by and told me. That girl's always snitching on everybody," Ben said. Abigail Montgomery lived next door, and her mother Maggie was Mrs. Wilson's best friend. "If you didn't get into trouble, you wouldn't have to worry about people tattling." "I suppose." "No supposing. It's the truth. Wash your hands so you can help me with the rest of these dills." "Are you going to tell Pa? Maybe if I put in a good word, he won't tan your hide when he gets home." "You mean if he gets home?" "Don't talk that way. Your father's a hard worker and a good provider." Ben couldn't argue with the fact that Pa worked hard. After cooking all winter in a logging camp, Pa piloted the Wanigan and floating cook shack that followed the loggers on their Spring River drive. When he returned to the boarding house in June, Pa was almost like a stranger to Ben. In the summer and early fall, Pa worked at a local sawmill. Before Pa sat down to supper that night, he turned to Ben. "I hear you got in trouble at school." The two other boarders smiled. "Ain't there no secrets in this town?" Ben couldn't believe the news had traveled out to the sawmill. "Were you running off at the mouth again?" Ben nodded. "I've half a mind to take you with me to camp next week." "Are you joshing?" Ben sat up. "You ain't learning nothing with washing blackboards." Mrs. Wilson stepped back from the stove and turned toward Pa. "What about Ben finishing school?" "I only got 1 grade to go," Ben said. "What's the difference if I quit this year or next?" "And I could use a cookie," Pa said. $25 a month is good money for a boy Ben's age. $25 for being a cook's helper? That'd be a whole lot better than getting splinters from an old school desk. "You measure an education by more than money," Mrs. Wilson said. "I know," Ben said, "but you've always told me that the life experience is important too. Just think of all I'd learn about the logging business. I could be with Pa. Best of all, I'd be out of your hair, Mrs. Wilson." "Wouldn't that be dandy? If I wasn't bothering you all the time, you'd be able to—" "Whoa there," Pa chuckled. "Take a breath." Mrs. Wilson walked over from the stove and gave a hug. "Don't you ever call yourself a bother, Ben Ward. Looking after you has been one of the joys of my life." "Can I go, Pa? You promise you'll be quiet in my cook shack?" Ben smiled and nodded. "It's settled then." At dawn on the following Monday, Pa and Ben rode to the Blackwater logging camp on the tote teamster's wagon. Mrs. Wilson had taken Ben aside the night before and said, "You send me a letter now and then so I can keep up on you and Pa. And speaking of Jack," she paused and touched Ben's shoulder, "your father may not always show it, but he cares a whole lot about you. The trouble is, having lived through the war and the loss of your mother like he has, he's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." Mrs. Wilson looked sad, then forced a smile. "And if Jack gets too crabby, you remind him that he'll catch more flies with honey than vinegar." The air was cold and foggy as Ben and Pa climbed in the wagon seat. When the teamster clicked to match Gray's, a freight wagon lurched forward, and the load of food barrels was cooking utensils forward, and the load— oh my goodness. Sorry, children. When the teamsters clicked and marched the Grays, the freight wagon lurched forward, and the load of food barrels and cooking utensils clanked together in back. A chill breeze blew down Ben's neck, and the damp smell of rotting ferns mingled with the fresh straw that lined the wagon box. The trees were bare except for the smoky gold of the tamarack needles and the patches of red oak leaves that stubbornly clung to the branches. The road, which was well graded at first, got rougher as the wagon turned east and headed into the spruce swamp. "How far is it to the camp?" Ben asked, his teeth rattling as the wagon bounced over rock and into a pothole. He squinted into the hazy pink sun that was trying to burn through the fog. "About 35 miles, ain't it?" Pa called to the teamster over the squeaky wagon springs. "Yep," the teamster said, a short fellow who had his cap pulled down over his ears. He was even less talkative than Pa. "The road's bumpy in spots," Pa said to Ben, "but that won't matter once the snow smooths over and they can haul supplies by sleigh." "Are we the first wagon to use this road?" Ben watched a stump in the middle nearly scrape the wagon tongue. Freshly cut brush and unlimbed trees were piled on both sides of the trail. "I'll bet you made lots of trips already," Pa said, turning to the driver. "Ain't you?" "Yep," the teamster said. When they finally arrived at the logging camp, it was almost dark. Ben's jaw dropped. "Nothing's built yet, Pa." "Looks like the cook shack and the clerk's office are nearly done," Pa said. "And them log piles," he waved down the clearing, "show where the bunkhouse, the barn, and the blacksmith shop will all go." "But where is everybody?" Ben has expected to see a camp full of loggers and teamsters, but the only men in sight were the clerk and the wood butcher. Till later in November, there'll only be a couple dozen fellows here building the camp and swamping the roads. The saw crews can't start until the roads and the landing are done. Do you put new buildings up every year, Ben said. Bark chips and wood shavings were trampled into the mud, and the air smelled of pine pitch. If the timber is real thick, we can work out of the same site a couple of years in a row. Otherwise, we start fresh every season. You should have been here on the day I hauled the cook range in. The teamster said, stringing together more words than he'd uttered all day and pointing his thumb toward the doorless cook shack. That was a doozy. We'd better unload and get some supper ready, Pa said. The boys will be coming from the woods before too long. Will I get to help the loggers out and cut when they start felling trees? Ben asked. He gazed toward the towering pines to stand in the south. I bet those big ones really crash when they go down. We'll see, Pa said, stepping through the door. For now, you'd better fire up the stove. The driver brung us.